Okay, hello, good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, whatever. Hello, gentle listener, and welcome to what'll be the third of my audio blog posts. Today I wanted to talk about an idea it's a little bit nebulous, but the basic idea is that I think we would all benefit if more of us spent more of our time thinking about everything from a more cosmic perspective. Now, I'm not thinking about this in some kind of silly, stupid, new agey sort of way, but what I mean is sort of recognizing the big picture of things. It's not something that's automatic or natural to us to think about the scale of the actual universe, whether it be the scale in space or the scale in time, but it can be useful, I think, because it diffuses many of our own personal prejudices. The tendency to be parochial, to be myopic, is often a cause of much of our strife. And perhaps even more importantly or more fundamentally, it's a cause of our tendency not to rethink our points of view, become more dogmatic. If you don't expose yourself to the idea that there are other points of view, it's easy to think that you must be right, and anyone who disagrees with you doesn't just merely have a different opinion and is not merely wrong but evil. It doesn't take too much thinking to recognize how silly that is, but you have to actually think about it. And the ultimate different point of view is the bird's eye view, so to speak. The view from nowhere, maybe you could call it. I've heard that used before. Carl Sagan gave a really nice general idea of this in his book, Pale Blue Dot, and in the section of that book in which he talks about looking at that little dot being Earth. And he talks about how all of the emperors, all the wars, all the confident religions, etc., all took place on that little blue pixel. And it gives you a really wonderful impression of just how silly so many of our day-to-day concerns are. That general idea is kind of the thing that I'm thinking of. And if you can find this segment of that on YouTube. Some people have done a very good job of juxtaposing his audiobook version of that, read by the man himself, with some very nice imagery that goes along with the words, and I do recommend it. It's very pleasant, very well done. But any version of it, really, you just listen to it. You don't need to look at a video. It's brilliant. Or read the book. But I think it's even useful to go beyond that, because even from the point of view of the Voyager spacecraft looking back at Earth from, I don't remember where it was, somewhere around the orbit of Saturn, the Earth is still visible. But on any kind of reasonable, what you might call ordinary perspective at the level of the universe, the Earth is not visible. To a good first approximation, the Earth doesn't even exist when you're looking at the whole universe. I mean, it is so small, so tiny in space and in time that it might as well not exist. Now, the time thing is a little bit more difficult because the Earth itself has been around for about 4.5 billion years, and that's a good sized chunk of the time since the Big Bang. So, that's not negligible. Maybe a third of the time the universe has existed, the Earth has existed. I could say that it's worth not dismissing that. If time will go on forever or even for trillions of years, which most estimates suggest that by the end of that time, it's unlikely for life to be possible. Well, maybe I'm misremembering that. I know by the time of Google years have passed, all the black holes should have evaporated in the universe. So basically, if that is the way things are going, be a haze of elementary particles at maximum entropy. But, again, that's assuming that things proceed the way they seem to be proceeding. There's a good chance of that, but not 100% by any means. There may be things we just don't know. And that's key also to the point of view I'm trying to make. People get very wrapped up in arguments about politics, for instance. And social media has made this even more prominent, even more noticeable. But it's remarkable to me just how much people seem to think that this election cycle's political disputes are the be-all and end-all of the world. Now, maybe they don't think that consciously. They probably don't, but they act that way. So many people act that way. The SJWs versus the alt-right people act like every disagreement is Armageddon. This is deciding the fate of the universe, when really it's deciding some specifics of a very small part of the history of a very small part of the surface of a very small planet in a typical solar system, one among 100 billion or so in a very typical galaxy among between 100 billion and a trillion galaxies in the visible universe, which is probably just one very, even by the most conservative estimates, is one very small part of an extremely much larger universe that may well be infinite. And outside of that infinite space, of which there may be other tiers of infinite inflating space, in which many little bubbles of infinity take place. Now, you can have infinities within other infinities that form thanks to higher dimensional geometry. This is possible. And I'm not the one to explain how that works to you because, well, if you want to understand how that can work, I do recommend Brian Greene's The Hidden Reality, where he talks about it. He does a really great job of explaining how a space that forms de novo, not already infinite, can become infinite. And, you can, it's fun, it's nifty, but I'm not going to get distracted by that. Anyway, thinking about infinity puts a lot of things in perspective. And that's useful, I think. It doesn't necessarily make everything seem futile, but it can make everything seem less locally crucial. And it can also give us better priorities. It doesn't need to make every priority seem foolish, but it can give us a better sense of priorities. And let's think about it. So many local, state, federal elections and international political occurrences seem so important. And at some level, they are important, obviously. Every meal, from a certain point of view, is important. To the organism that's eating, every meal is, to some degree, a matter of life and death. But every organism is transient. That's my point about iterations of zero. We all come into existence, we exist for a while, and then we stop. If I don't get a meal, or don't find water, or don't have shelter, this is not an existential threat to the external universe, although it is a threat to my universe, my experience of the universe. But that's going to be finite anyway. It has a beginning, end, although its end is not defined well from my point of view. I know it's there somewhere, not very far away. So each individual election that happens seems important. But how many elections are remembered even a year later by most people? The elections we do remember, how many of the specifics of that election do we remember? I mean, I think we can all remember the 2000 election as a pretty big deal because of the voter difficulties here in South Florida, with all the hanging chads and the Supreme Court getting involved and deciding who won the state and getting those electoral votes. And the difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore as the president. It was consequential, certainly, as elections go, and it was unusual as elections go. But how many people remember many of the specifics? How many people remember the campaign talking points? The things that got people all fired up and angry, the things pundits yelled at each other. I doubt the pundits themselves remember very well, unless they look back or listen to a recording or watch an old video. How many of us remember anything about whatever the election was that happened at the turn of the 20th century? I think most of us remember that George Washington was the first constitutional president of the United States under the U.S. Constitution as it stands now. But what do we know about his politics, the average person? We remember that he was a slave owner because that is something of particular consequence to us now, because the consequences of the peculiar institution's effects on our culture so great and terrible that we are far from having gotten over them, even still. 160 years after the slavery officially was abolished. It's an important specification there, the official part. That's just the United States history. From a certain point of view, the United States didn't exist before 1776, though, of course, the physical land, all of this stuff that's here was there, but the country as it is didn't exist. And then you go back a few hundred years before that, before 1492, the entire Western Hemisphere was peopled by descendants of those who had come from northeastern Asia 10,000 years before and had no knowledge or memory of that process. And there were many different cultures and many different peoples. Now, most of those cultures are for the most part gone. But even at the time, most of them couldn't remember past, their grandparents, maybe their great-grandparents' time. The continuity was hardly there. What humans felt and feel as deep time, any history at all, really starts maybe 10,000 years ago. And serious history is much less noteworthy until a few thousand years ago. So all that stuff gets lost in time like tears in the rain, to quote Rutger Hauer's character in Blade Runner. And it's going to continue to get lost, even though supposedly, you say, well, once something's online, it's forever. It's always there. But if everything's always there, it's just the same thing as nothing being there, because any one thing is going to be, or very likely to be, unnoticeable. Now, there are things we do remember, and remember very clearly. These are things that are of quote-unquote cosmic importance. We remember Euclid's geometry. Whether or not Euclid was a real person, we remember that. We remember the Pythagorean theorem. We remember Socrates and Aristotle, the ideas of epistemology and logic, mathematics, Archimedes. We remember Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo, Newton, Darwin. Well, we remember Einstein. I think almost everybody in the world would know the name of Einstein. These are people who recognized great and sweeping cosmic level aspects of the real world that exists outside of ourselves. We remember Schrödinger and Planck and Heisenberg. Many of us remember Feynman. But the vast majority of everything that we consider so important right now will not even be important to us next year. Much of it will not even be important to us next week or tomorrow. But that doesn't mean we're not important. It just means that we need to pick our focus a little more carefully. Because I'm very convinced by David Deutsch's arguments in his book, The Beginning of Infinity, that we have the possibility here that our civilization is the beginning of a future that could be effectively unlimited. It is possible that our descendants, biological, mechanical, or some combination of the two, will go on to spread across at least, all the accessible universe. And so our survival itself may be of consequence to the universe at large. Now, I know that there are people, many among my friends and even myself at times, who think that's actually not a good thing. Given humans' track record, we tend to wreck a lot of the things we touch. But that's a little unfair. We're very powerful relative to other creatures that have ever existed. And competence is dangerous. We're not, contrary to popular belief, inherently malevolent. In fact, I happen to think that we are the greatest example ever seen that good really is stronger than evil, and that the creative force is stronger than the destructive. And I base this on a couple of simple notions. We know the second law of thermodynamics is a fundamental law based on probability, which is math. And as the old saying goes, physicists bow only to mathematicians, and mathematicians bow only to God. But let's face it, they don't really bow to God. God presumably can't dictate that 2 plus 2 equals anything but 4. And be logically consistent. Presumably, God has to be logically consistent if there is such an entity. So, what was I saying? Oh, yeah, the second law of thermodynamics means that left to their own devices, things fall apart. If you don't do anything, things break and break down. Let alone how easy it is to break things actively, to destroy things actively. And yet, despite that, despite the fact that the forces of nature are seemingly stacked against us, we continue to make progress at an ever more rapid pace lately. We continue to make new things. We continue to make new art. We continue to make new science, or to discover new science. We continue to break ground in new engineering. We learn more about math. We make progress, even though things fall apart. Even though it's so much easier to destroy than to create. So, good must be much more prevalent and or much more powerful. I suspect both. But assholes make a lot of noise and destruction because it's easy. Nasty people can do a lot of damage. It's easy to do a lot of damage. A lot harder to undo damage, to prevent damage, to make new things. It's not impressive to be able to kill a lot of people. It's scary, not good, but it's not impressive. And we have to stop making celebrities out of people who do it. But that's another discussion entirely. The point is that we have the capacity to go on into a functionally limitless future. And although the second law of thermodynamics says that it's very likely that our universe will eventually peter out into a heat death, that's billions and billions of years from now at the very least. In that time, even if we don't continue to make progress as fast as we're making it now, if we continue to make progress at all, and our descendants still exist billions of years from now, we will have learned things that we can't even imagine. I mean, that's part of the nature of progress. If you could predict what discoveries are going to happen in the future, you would effectively already have discovered them, so they wouldn't be discoveries. New things are unpredictable. But we can say this: there will be things about the nature of reality itself that will be surprises. There won't be quite as many of the really big surprises as there were in the past, because, of course, as you approach the final truth asymptotically, you're getting closer and closer to it, so advances are smaller and smaller percentage-wise, but nevertheless they can be just as profound. They can be turning points. So who knows? Our descendants may learn ways to reverse the entropy of the universe locally, and Frank Tipler, in his Physics of Immortality, discussed one possible way that sort of thing could happen if the universe is headed toward a big crunch. Now, almost all of the data really makes that an almost certain non-future. All that we know really makes it look pretty much certain that there's not going to be a big crunch. Pretty much certain. We're Bayesians here, so we don't say 100%, but it's pretty damn close. So who knows what's going to happen? We don't know what. We may learn to make new universes of our own. I mean, we already know, based on inflationary cosmology and other aspects of general relativity and so forth, that it is possible in principle to make new universes. It may be that new universes are coming into existence. Well, inflationary cosmology suggests if there is eternal inflation, that new quote-unquote pocket universes are coming into existence all the time, but they're so far away from us that even in principle we could never reach them. But it may be possible that we would be able to create new universes of our own, and perhaps to populate them. It's a big question. It's by no means certain that that's doable. We might be able to make new universes, but never have anything to do with them after they've been made. They may pinch off from our universe, never to connect with us again. In which case, it's not very satisfying to have made a new universe. At least not as satisfying as you'd like it to be. It could be satisfying, I guess. Certainly you'd have a bit of a sense of an accomplishment. Although it'd be sad not to ever know what became of it. Again, there's a lot we don't even know what we don't know. That's the nature of ignorance, real ignorance, and the nature of real discovery. So, that's going to be interesting. So if we can keep that kind of perspective and say, look, we are very small individually. Our parochial concerns are very parochial. What seems to matter so much today, almost all of it, will not matter even tomorrow, let alone next year, next decade, next century. People who seem to keep our attention so much right now, the current president of the United States, feels like to many the biggest catastrophe politically the world has ever seen, Genghis Khan level stuff. But he's probably not. Probably just a minor inconvenience, minor embarrassment. And even if you're a fan, he's still minor. Things like, even things like climate change are not as important as they are sometimes made out to be, because they're not literally going to destroy all life on the earth, at least not based on any sensible models that I'm aware of. But they will make life a lot harder, and they will harm a lot of the natural beauty we appreciate, and bring a lot of suffering to a lot of people and animals, and if plants could suffer, to plants. So that at least is a more large-scale concern. Certainly, it should be more important than who gets elected dog catcher next election cycle. But it's hard for us to think that way. So getting into the habit of thinking on larger scales, larger time scales, larger space scales is important. Because again, far greater than climate change, there are other existential threats that are real. The possibility of an asteroid hitting the planet. Well, asteroids always hit the planet. The possibility of a really big asteroid hitting the planet on a long enough time scale is not a possibility. It's more or less a certainty, close enough to one. The possibility of supervolcanoes really, really wiping out civilization. Possibility of global thermonuclear war is not zero. That could at least really devastate human civilization and might just set us back to the point where a subsequent catastrophe could wipe us out completely. The possibility that we could make an artificial general intelligence that's not aligned with our goals, and also has goals that not only wouldn't be aligned with ours, but which we would consider terrible, and would not produce progress of any kind that we would ever want to see happen, is not zero. And so that's something we need to keep in mind. We need to plan for a potentially unlimited future and potentially unlimited space. These are the only scales at which things that humans do actually even really exist. Everything else is not unimportant. Like I said, your next meal is important. It's a matter of, relatively speaking, life and death. Your next breath is definitely a matter of life and death. But emotionally, how important is your next meal? Is your next breath? If you can't get your next breath, obviously it's of tremendous emotional importance, because as biological organisms, that's the primary thing. Staying alive long enough to reproduce, we're built, we're evolved, we're shaped to have that desire to survive, because animals with no desire to survive don't survive as often and don't leave as many offspring. So pretty quickly, the ones with a really strong desire to survive outnumber those with a weaker desire to survive. That doesn't necessarily make it a real and important need or drive. Sometimes it's useful to get beyond that, to recognize that even your desire to survive is parochial. But the point is, it would be nice if people got less caught up with what some idiot in traffic did, cut them off. And I get upset about this myself. What some idiot politician says, what some loved one of ours says in a moment of anger, or what mistake some person we love makes, or some person we hate makes. All these things are of only local consequence, and most of them wash out on larger scales. Only a very few of these individual points and concerns end up escaping from the event horizon and becoming real. And we should kind of try to learn how to approach them with that attitude. First of all, it would reduce our stress a fair amount, I think, even though sometimes it may seem like a bleak perspective to say in 100 years we'll all be dead. But it is almost certainly true that the vast majority of people currently alive will be dead in 100 years. So most of our day-to-day concerns will be irrelevant, will cease to have existed. Only a few things will really matter and continue to matter. And we should try to figure out what those things are, because those are the things that really do, in something potentially approaching a cosmic level matter. Because again, we do have the potential to become cosmic level importance ourselves, or rather our descendants, in the future. And we can only do that, I think, if we try to become less parochial. Because parochial concerns often are things that lead to feuds and irrational arguments and violence and war, and that could lead us to not actually continue to exist into the far future, in which case, literally and somewhat ironically, every concern will have been utterly unimportant. I think that's probably worth avoiding.